This is Dr. Dennis Bielfeldt of the Institute of Lutheran Theology. We're looking at the ontological argument by Leibniz. And I've got some things scrawled on the board here. At this critical point in the argument, he says that if it's possible for a necessary being to exist, then the necessary being exists. And of course, then we're supposed to think, well, is it possible for a necessary being to exist? And I guess we're supposed to say, well, okay, it's either possible for a necessary being to exist or it's not possible for the next necessary being to exist. Well, this seems positively closed-minded to say that it's not possible for a necessary being to exist. So we're supposed to say it's possible for a necessary being to exist. And therefore, if it's possible for the necessary being to exist, then by modus ponens, the antecedent holds here. That means the consequent is so. The necessary being exists. So God exists. Now, of course, we're not discriminating real well here between de re and de dicto necessity, because, I mean, we could say that a necessary being exists contingently, or we could say necessarily a contingent being exists, and all of those things might not get clearly said here unless we formalize all of this. This is called modal logic, and it's very interesting. You take the second course here in the sequence, God's Logic and Semantics. We deal a lot with the questions like this. But I suppose we're supposed to think mathematically. Imagine that the square root of 2, you're supposed to prove that the square root of 2 is rational. Well, of course, you show that it's irrational. Square root of 2 is irrational. So you show that it's impossible that the square root of 2 is rational. By showing that, then you've shown that the square root of 2 must be irrational. One could say that it's possible, if it's possible for the square root of 2 to be irrational, the square root of 2 is irrational. And this is a well-known principle in so-called S5 in modal logic. In S5, whenever you have a formula like this, where this means possibility, this means necessity, this means possibility, and this can be any assertion. Let's say God is. If it's possible that it's necessarily the case that something is possible, then in S5 you're able to lop off these and move to the last modal operator. So obviously, if it's possible that a necessary being exists, then if we can lop that off, a necessary being exists. Now, to get into this more deeply at this point, we can't do. Really, S5 is plausible for all kinds of work that you might use modal logic to do. To justify it here, in its use here, is something that I'm not going to try to do right now, except to say that if God really is a necessary being, then God seems a lot like a mathematical object. And a mathematical object either doesn't exist, mathematical object is either contradictory or it exists. And if God's like a mathematical object, then the possibility of God shows that God is. And of course, a mathematical object is necessary for the square root of 2 to be irrational. So that's necessarily the case. And if God is necessary in that sense, just to show the possibility of God, then brings about God's existence as a necessary being. All right. Well, some of you probably know that it's very important when we're talking about Leibniz to talk about his best of all possible worlds and his so-called theodicy, right? He's very famous for holding that this is the best of all possible worlds. The idea here is that God is omnipotent, omniscient, and benevolent, and the free creator of the world. That's what it is to be God. But, of course, things could be other than what they are, right? There are other possible worlds rather than this one. And, of course, from Leibniz, we get this notion of a possible world. This gets worked up in the 20th century from Hinteke, Kripke, certainly. And David Lewis does wonderful stuff with possible worlds, semantics, and a number of other philosophers. So let us suppose that this is not the best of all possible worlds, that there is a world that could be better. Now, if this world is not the best of all possible worlds, then at least one of the following statements that I'm going to make must be the case. Either God was not powerful enough to bring about a better world, right, one, or God did not know how this world would develop after its creation, or God did not wish this world to be the best, or God did not create the world. One of these things must be true if this is not the best of all possible worlds. Or that there was no other possible worlds from which God could choose. But any one of these disjuncts here that I've just mentioned contradicts the notion that God is omnipotent, omniscient, benevolent, and the free creator of the world. Therefore, this is the best of all possible worlds. It follows from the very notion of God. Now, you're saying, well, how could this be the best of all possible worlds? There's all kinds of problems in the world, right? You look out, but you've got to think of God now. He's got a whole domain of possible individuals he could instantiate. He's got Alexander the Great. He knows that if he instantiates Alexander the Great, the active unity of Alexander the Great, his unity is going to do certain things out in the world. So if he instantiates Alex, these things are going to happen. If he instantiates Adolf Hitler, these things are going to happen. If he instantiates Mother Teresa, these things are going to happen. But these unities already exist in the mind of God. All he has to do is pick which ones to instantiate. So given the fact that there is a sum total of possible individuals that God has to choose from, God does, according to Leibniz, instantiate just that set of individuals which leads to the least amount of human happiness, or least amount of human unhappiness, least amount of the unhappiness of the cosmos, least amount of not being the best. And of course, for him, a better world is one that is rich and diverse. So you have definite criteria. So maybe a world without Adolf Hitler would seem better to us, but it wouldn't be as rich and diverse as a world with Adolf Hitler. So at this point, I mean, Leibniz is a pretty good theologian here at this point. I mean, he's got some real commitments. He's got a commitment to God the Creator and God creating the best. And now all he has to do is work out how that works. And he says, well, there's a number of individuals. God creates, instantiates just those individuals that make this world better than any other world that could have been instantiated. Now you're saying, well, give me an example. Star Trek. Last thing I'm going to say about Leibniz. There was this great Star Trek episode, right, with Captain Kirk, and of course he always fall in love with a girl somewhere on a different planet. They all had miniskirts in the 60s, but that's over. So anyway, Captain Kirk falls in love with a woman who, they travel back in the 1930s. He falls in love with a woman, and he's really loving her. And of course Spock, they're trying to get back to wherever they're coming from, whatever century that is. And of course Spock's got some gadgets, and he's got a nice little cathode tube and a couple other things. That's going to get him back to the future. But as Spock is putting all this together, Kirk is falling in love with this woman. Anyway, she's running out to cross the street, and there's a car coming. And this little machine that Spock has put together has been able to kind of go in the future enough to see that actually Germany won World War II. And then this little machine was actually able to go forward enough to kind of show that this woman that Kirk was loving was going to be the woman that was kind of the head of the peace movement in America in the late 1930s. So the woman is about ready to get hit by the car, and of course our good friend Kirk wants to go out and save her, but Bones holds him back, right? I think it's Bones, maybe it's Spock, who knows? I saw it 35 years ago. So anyway, they hold him back. Why? Because, of course, it's far better that she be destroyed than that she live, and that she live for a noble cause. Right? Now, of course, these guys aren't God, but you can see how this analogy applies. It would be far better for certain people who have cancer, who are very noble. There's certain people that go down in plane wrecks that are very noble, because we don't see things from the absolute standpoint. But if you see things from the absolute standpoint, and you have with you the principle of the best, diversity, you just have to see as a matter of reason, but you'll have to take it on faith, that God creates the best of all possible worlds. This is Dr. Dennis Bielfeldt of the Institute of Lutheran Theology, and I'll be back with you soon.